I hope this is working. There we go. All right. Welcome back to The Great Philosophers at Fanshawe College. That's PHIL-1006. This is Tuesday's live stream. I wish I could tell you I'm going to have a very regular schedule. Um, but of course, it's very difficult right now. I'm going to try and be online on Thursdays. Tuesdays and Thursdays, we're covering 2 modules each week. On Tuesday, I'll be covering the first module, and on Thursdays, the kind of second module of each week. So this week, we're doing a module 3, which is Aristotle, and some kind of Roman philosophers. And then on Thursday, I hope to cover, we're going to kind of skip ahead to kind of the medieval period. So that's the plan anyway. I hope to be online sometime around 12:30, 1 o'clock. But again, it's situation's kind of chaotic at home right now. Um, and again, you don't have to watch live. The idea is just that the videos are here for your reference. If you find them useful, if you would rather have, kind of a lecture kind of format, the slides and the book by themselves, I think will be sufficient. I'll be keeping an eye on the chat box. So if anybody is watching live, that's great. If you're not, that's fine. It's going to be there for later. So last week we talked a little bit about Socrates and Plato. Now, Socrates did not write anything down. He was he was someone that just kind of hung around Athens and asked probing questions to the citizens, and eventually was brought to trial and executed for it. Plato, his student, used Socrates in his dialogues, first to just kind of talk about his life, but it eventually became a mouthpiece for Plato's own views. And Plato's views, as we saw, were pretty rationalistic, very metaphysically focused. Plato viewed the world of ideas as more real than the material, particular world. What really exists are not particular instances of things, but the ideas, the thing they have in common. So there's the form, the idea of beauty is more real, more fundamental than specific beautiful things. Aristotle is Plato's student. So we have kind of like we have like 3 players here, right? Socrates who taught Plato, Plato who taught Aristotle. Aristotle broke with his teacher Plato and had much more of an empiricist bent. Now, if you remember from earlier, we have this kind of rationalist versus empiricist divide that really characterizes Western philosophy kind of ever since, which is a debate over what fundamentally is the source of knowledge. Is it observation or is it reason? I know most people think, well, you need both. I'm like, yes, we need both. But this is a debate over what is foundational, right? Do we legitimize the use of observation through reason, or is observation does it kind of legitimize itself? So for 20 years, Aristotle was in the academy. He left to found his own school. Maybe after Plato died, there was like a dispute over who would actually kind of lead the school. Aristotle had his own ideas. The other students of Plato wanted to be kind of more faithful to Plato's teachings. So Aristotle had a bit of an interesting life, actually. He founded his own school. He became the tutor to a young man named Alexander, who would later become Alexander the Great. He left Athens, did all kinds of really interesting things, and then returned to Athens about 335 BC. And Aristotle's outlook is different from Plato's, as I said, more empirical, but pretty much just as influential in his own way. And in fact, Aristotle was probably more influential to medieval Christian thought than Plato was. But that's something we're going to talk about in the next module. So the first major difference, as I said, is about the kind of metaphysical outlook, specifically about rationalism versus empiricism. So, of course, Plato believed that universals and ideas were foundational. It was foundational to his metaphysics, foundational to his epistemology. What that means, of course, is that the forms are the right objects of knowledge. They are metaphysically and ontologically prior to particulars, right? The ideal triangle, the idea of equality, is necessary for particular triangles, particular equal things to exist. Aristotle kind of reverses that picture, right? Aristotle thinks that the universal is not separate, but is instantiated in it and by it. It does not exist apart from particulars. Um, so, uh, again, Kenny does a much better job than I can do in, a 20, 30-minute video and kind of bowdlerizing Aristotle. Um, but if I had to give you a very brief explanation of the difference here, I'd say Aristotle would think that the reason we perceive universals, that is, properties in common to many objects, is kind of a pattern recognition thing. We're able to see the similarities, and from the similarities instantiated in things, we kind of create a category to which it belongs. Whereas Plato sees it the other way around. The category, the idea, the abstraction is first. Um, and this kind of reversal, Aristotle, who started with the particular and then generalized, really is in the spirit of his empiricism. Because he was a bit of a proto-scientist, right? So Aristotle's the kind of guy who would go to the Mediterranean and look at like what fishermen are catching in their nets and just kind of start cataloging marine life on the basis of their morphology, which is just a fancy word for their shape, their characteristics, right? For example, he knew fish and sea mammals were distinct, that dolphins and whales weren't a kind of fish. He wrote on cephalopods, octopuses, he wrote on mollusks. He knew there was a distinction between vertebrates and invertebrates. That was pretty fundamental in the animal world. Um, this is the kind of stuff Plato would not really bother doing. I can't imagine Plato going down to the Mediterranean Sea and like starting to dissect whatever fishermen dredge up in their necks to make this taxonomy and to make this classification. But of course, for Aristotle, who thought that we could work out universal truths by extrapolating from our observation of the particulars, this makes a lot of sense. Um, and it wasn't just about empiricism for Aristotle. He also thought Plato's theory didn't make a lot of sense on its own terms. Um, so one of the things he criticizes Plato's theory of forms or theory of ideas for is kind of a weird infinite regress or circularity problem. Um, Again, Kenny does a really nice job talking about it. But basically the criticism is this, right? So if everything that is large because it participates in the ideal largeness, which is prior. According to Plato, ideal largeness is itself large. So forms themselves have the properties that they are. So the form of blue is itself blue, right? The form of large things must be itself large. So particular large things, along with the idea large, says Aristotle, forms a new set of things to be explained. So you need a new idea. And you can kind of run this indefinitely, resulting in infinite ideas. So Aristotle's criticism, let me just go over this again, is that, look, Plato says that the forms themselves have the properties they say they explain. But if you have the property you're trying to explain, you're not explaining it, right? Because now we have a new set of things. We have the set of all things the form explains plus the form itself. So what can explain that? Well, a form of that form. But then we could just run that criticism again, and we have an infinitely many forms. So it's not really as explanatory as we thought. You can, if you're interested in this issue, it's kind of one of those weird philosophical arguments. Aristotle calls it the third man problem, because you need like a third thing to explain the two things you just explained. It's really a fascinating literature. So for Aristotle, he says, look, only particular objects exist. Right? There's no such thing as an idea. A universal or an idea is not a thing separate from particulars. It's more kind of, we're talking about a class of things. Forms are present only where they concretely actually exist. This isn't exactly right, but again, a 20-minute version of Aristotle has to simplify things. One way to think about it is to think of redness as not a separate idea from all red things. What is redness? The collection of all red things, right? So if you want to understand what redness is, you'd put all the red things together in a box and say, well, this is redness right here, right? Um, so it's kind of, or it's kind of the pattern recognition our minds say when we see all the things that are similar. I'm going to skip over the four causes because I think it'll be more, we're going to kind of come back to it in the medieval stuff anyway. Um, but I do want to talk about Aristotle's ethics because I think, compared to the Republic, which I did a bad job of talking about last week, I think Aristotle's ethics is really interesting, really intuitive, and actually pretty practical. I think I reflect on Aristotle's ethics all the time. I don't usually think about Plato's Republic when I'm thinking through political problems, through ethical problems in my life, but I do think about Aristotle a lot. So let's talk about Aristotle's ethics, putting aside his metaphysics. Um, so for Aristotle, and again, the Kenny chapter on his ethics is really, really good, and I suggest you read it. But for Aristotle, the goal of ethics is a Greek term called eudaimonia, which it's hard to translate. Often it's kind of, we say it's happiness, but really in the literature I've seen the term flourishing more. So you should flourish. Um, and what to flourish mean is much more than being happy. The idea is that you should just kind of be a good, flourishing human that, that in the sense that you've kind of worked on yourself and you're the best version of yourself you can be. Um, so Aristotle thinks about flourishing because, again, he's an empiricist, um, which means that his view of ethics is kind of based on observation, on kind of a proto-scientific concept, on what we might think of a naturalistic concept of good. What naturalistic means is that it's not abstract, it's concrete, it's in the world. So when Aristotle says we should be good humans, he's thinking in the same sense that we'd say, well, that's a good plant, right? So if I'm outside in my garden, I have I say that's a good tomato plant. What do I mean by that? I mean, it's healthy, it's robust, it produces a lot of tomatoes, the leaves are healthy. And for Aristotle, that's going to be the same thing. When we say good, we don't mean an abstract idea. We mean just being a good human is no different than being a good plant, being a good, a good shark. Like a good shark is a healthy shark that is able to do its shark things well. And the goal of ethics is to be good in that sense, not just being happy, but being good at being a human. So good is for Aristotle in a way related to your function. How am I doing for time here? How long have I talked for? Let me just check my. I've been live for 19 minutes. So good is related to function. When we say a plant is good, we mean it's healthy, its stalk is strong, it's producing. When we say what is a good knife is sharp because its function is to cut, right? What's a good movie? A good movie is something that's entertaining. So the fulfillment of your function in an excellent way is going to be a virtue. So the virtue of a knife is its sharpness. And what goes for knives and plants and sharks is going to go for people too. A good human is just going to excel at its functions. A good person is a virtuous person. It exemplifies excellent functioning. Now, of course, people are going to be more complicated than a plant or a knife, but the principle is the same there. If we understand what it is to be human, we can become the best versions of humans just by becoming excellent at our functions. So how do you arrive at flourishing? How do you be a good human? Well, you consider the virtues. You consider how to be excellent at your functions. For human beings, you could think of virtues as character traits, for which Aristotle says you cultivate by education will guide your actions in life. So they should become kind of habits of your behavior, right? You are habitually good. As a habit, you're excellent at what you do. If you're not sure how to do this, what Aristotle suggests is a very common sense thing, which is asking yourself, well, what would the virtuous person do? Just reflect on the person who exemplifies the right character traits. That's how you go and be virtuous. Um, and again, if you think of this naturalistically, empirically, scientifically, through observation of individuals in the world, right, or functions in the world, a good car, for example, will usually start even in cold weather, right? If it only starts sometimes, it does not possess the virtue of its function, reliability, say. Right? It's like that. That's why Aristotle talks about habit. To possess the virtue of honesty is to tell the truth, as a matter of course, because it comes from your character, right? So you have the habit of it. It's not sporadic. It's not sometimes. You're just right. If you're virtuous because you're good at a function, you do it as a matter of course. Um, and his theory of the virtues is actually really subtle and interesting and complicated. Kenny does a good job talking about it. Um, Let me just give you kind of the some highlights here. Um, so you might think to yourself, well, wait a minute. Being good at something is not the same as being moral or just, because you could be really good at stealing. Are you saying there's such a thing as a virtuous thief? Right? I might just habitually steal, and I might be really good at my function of stealing. So is that itself virtuous? Is that what it means to flourish, to be the best cat burglar? Aristotle says, no, hold on. We do need to distinguish virtue from vice. Not all virtues are not sorry. Let me rephrase that. Not everything you can perform well is a virtue, and part of that has to do with our social nature. To be a good human is not to be just good at a specific thing. It's to be good at all the things which you are supposed to be as a human. And Aristotle says if you observe the kind of creatures we are social animals, we're political animals. Humans do not live alone. Right? We always live in communities. It's what we are, it's how we survive, it's what we do. And again, so he's not going to have an abstract account of what are the virtues, of what is, right, the correct functions that you should have. Right? He's not going to have an abstract account of what makes stealing bad, even though you're really good at stealing. He's going to say, just look at what we do. Observe humans. The virtues, the real virtues, the functions you should be working on being excellent at, are those traits you seek out in other people. So suppose there's a really good liar and then a very honest person. Would we seek out company of the liar or of the honest person? Well, we'd prefer someone who's honest, right? We'd prefer an honest car mechanic to a dishonest one, even if the dishonest one is very good at lying to you about your car. So that's how we're able to know that honesty is a virtue, but lying is not. Because the virtue of honesty is conducive to social living, which is what we are. Humans are social creatures. Aristotle says we are the zoon politikon, the political animal. A zoon is the root word for zoo, by the way. So the way to think about it is that the traits in people that we wish to be with are the virtues, and those from people we avoid are the vices. All right, so if there's something that makes me want to avoid, no matter how good they are at it, no matter how good they are at lying, cheating, or stealing, if it makes me want to avoid that person, then it's a vice. If it makes me want to be with that person and live in a society with them, it's a virtue, because it's conducive to social living. And again, this is really observational. It's naturalistic. It's not like Plato, who's very abstract. Another aspect of the virtues for Aristotle is to understand them requires reflection, requires practical wisdom, which means it requires experience in life, in order to be able to see them correctly as a middle point between two extremes. So to understand the virtue of courage is to understand that it's a midpoint between being too cowardly and being too rash. Rash means you don't care about consequences, you just rush into it. So, for example, you're not courageous for Aristotle if you just rush into battle with no consideration for your own safety, for tactics, for whether you're supposed to play a role in a phalanx or something like that. And you're also not courageous if you're cowardly and you run away, right? To be courageous is to perform the appropriate action in the circumstance, right? You can have too much courage, you can have too little courage, and those become vices, right? Nobody wants to be in a battle with a guy who has no regard for his safety or the safety of others. And nobody wants to be in battle with someone who's cowardly and runs away, right? You want to be in battle with someone who is appropriately courageous. And this takes experience, character, discernment. Um, so here's a Calvin and Hobbes comic. So Calvin says, I'm going to paste Susie's pate with a slush ball. Then Hobbes says, some philosophers say that true happiness comes from a life of virtue. And then Calvin, of course, cleans his room, does his homework, makes a card, shovels the walk, sets the table, puts out the garbage, and then gets frustrated, hits Susie with a snowball, and says, someday I'll write my own philosophy book. Yeah, virtue needs some cheaper thrills. Of course, Aristotle says an adult person with experience is able to really understand the virtues. And as a 41-year-old dude with a couple kids, for me, this is definitely virtue. For my 9-year-old, right? Virtue does need some cheaper thrills. So there's something kind of, I guess, paternalistic about Aristotle's ethics here, maybe in a good way. Aristotle's politics, similar to his ethics. I'm just going to skip over this. You can kind of look at it here because I'm going over time. We're already at almost half an hour. All right, so let's talk a little bit about, just again, we're going to stop with Aristotle. We're going to talk about some other stuff here, about some other philosophers of the period. So we're going to talk about, I think, the Cynics, the Stoics, and the Epicureans. So around that time in Athens and ancient Greece, there were other schools of philosophy. Everybody had their own school of philosophy. The Sophists were still making a living teaching philosophy and rhetoric. Socrates kind of had the genre of like hassling people in the street, and Diogenes, the cynic, thought he could one-up Socrates and be even more in your face about it. So Diogenes lived in a bathtub on the streets of Athens. There's a legend about Diogenes. Who knows if this happens, but apparently Alexander the Great came to visit him and tried to tempt him and said, I'll give you anything you desire. And he was kind of the most powerful man in the whole Mediterranean basin at that point. And Diogenes just said, get out of my light. He's just casting a shadow. I'm trying to sunbathe here. The cheek, right? So the Cynics, which comes from the Greek word for canine, because they lived like, street dogs. So they would give away their wealth and lived as beggars. Because they thought that kind of the way to be happy was to let go of desire, because and it's kind of similar to Buddhism in a way that if you suffer when you want things you can't have. Now you can't have everything you want. It's impossible. So just start wanting less, right? Just let go of your desire. Diogenes was said to have only his tub that he slept in and a small cup to drink water. One day he saw a child approach the public fountain and drink out of his hands by cupping them. And Diogenes was impressed, and disgusted with himself, he threw away his cup and then slurped like a child from then on, because the child was better at living with nothing than he was. There's a famous painting of Diogenes living in his tub in the streets of Athens, saying he was the happiest man in Athens, indeed the happiest man in all of Greece, because he learned to let go of the things that cause him suffering, which is desire. So the Cynics obviously were a little too punk rock for the average person. So you all had later on, so we're 332, right, 200 BC, the rise of a school called Stoicism. So this is kind of an offshoot of the Cynics. In a way, it's like the Cynics in the sense that they believe that you should let go of desire so as to not suffer, but thought the Cynics kind of got it wrong, because Whereas the Cynics believed you have to let go of all your desires and have nothing, the Stoics kind of thought that, having nothing is itself a kind of desire. What you should do is align your will with the will of the natural world around you. So what happens to you is something you have to accept, including your place in the world. So you can grow up to be the son of a cobbler, and you are going to be a cobbler, and then you're just going to accept that because you're aligning your will with the natural world. You're not going to get rid of all your possessions and live on the street because you're resisting the world by doing that. You have to accept the world for what it is if you're going to be a Stoic. So the key to good living for the Stoics, as you see, there's a lot of emphasis on ethics and the good life here, is to align your will with natural law. Why do things get really ethical at this point? I think historically, if you put things in context, it's probably because of the Peloponnesian War, right? The war between Athens and Sparta, and the plague that decimated Athens at the time too. So there's a lot more concern with living a good life than there was with kind of theoretical issues here. But the theoretical concerns slowly were coming back as the Stoics evolved as a school. So the idea for the Stoics was you kind of align your will with natural law, with the way the world is. You live with the times. You don't drop out. You don't live on the streets. And as a result, it was a philosophy that was kind of appropriate for pretty much any social position in the ancient world. It was around the time where the Romans started conquering more and more of Europe and North Africa, right? The whole Mediterranean basin was slowly becoming absorbed by the Romans, so it became kind of an unofficial philosophy of the Roman Empire, the early Roman Empire anyway. And many Stoics were really famous statesmen. Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius is one of the most famous Stoics. He wrote a book called the Meditations, which, I think right now, given the state the world is in, the Meditations and Stoicism is really a nice philosophy to think about a little bit. Epictetus, another famous Stoic, had lived as a slave in Greece and was freed later on and wrote his book. So it's really a philosophy that no matter what your station in life is, you could be Roman emperor, or you could be a slave, and Stoicism could still speak to you. So the idea here again is that we're emphasizing self-control. You can't control the world, but you can control your reaction to it. You can react to your misfortune or fortune in a virtuous way. That's what's under your control. And if you're reasonable, if you're calm, then you can align your will and accept what happens and just control your reaction to it. Right? You're only unhappy when you are ignorant, when you don't have reason, when you lack self-control, and you react poorly to things you don't control. So as Epictetus the slave said, happiness and freedom begin with the clear understanding of one principle. Some things are within your control and some things are not. And your will and your attitude is always within your control. Or as Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor, wrote, you have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength. If you are distressed by anything external, the pain is not due to the thing itself, but to your estimate of it. And this you have the power to revoke at any moment. Right? If you ever watch Gladiator with Russell Crowe, right, Marcus Aurelius is depicted here. He ruled from 1601 to 180 AD. So, of course, we're fast-forwarding like 400 years, right? But so the Stoics, a school that began in Athens by Zeno of Citium, really became a very important philosophy of the Roman Empire for the next few hundred years. Okay, let me just skip ahead. So if you're interested in Stoicism, there's some books here. Let me close with a quick discussion of one last school, which is the Epicureans. So Epicurus was a philosopher who, again, we're going back BC here, or 341 to 70 BC. Right, as you can kind of tell, there was this period in ancient Athens and ancient Greece, 300, 200 BC, where a lot of these things got started, right? Plato, Aristotle, Cynics, Stoics, Epicureans, all this stuff was happening within about 100, 150 years, which blows my mind, like how creative and how fertile this time was. So the Epicureans were a school that began there. Epicurus kind of adopted the atomism of Democritus, who was a pre-Socratic who said that everything is made out of atoms. Again, very much ahead of his time there. Um, he argued that body and mind are made up of atoms, and when that configuration was lost, the soul was lost too. The death is the end for the Epicureans. The soul does not survive death. There is no afterlife. And that's good news, the Epicureans say, because death is therefore nothing to us. While we exist, death does not. And where death exists, we do not. Um, so one of the, right, again, because of the focus on what is it to be good, how to live life amidst suffering, right? Peloponnesian War, the plague of Athens, right? The Stoics say align your will with the natural law, whatever it is. Epicureans say suffering is nothing to us, right? We don't care about death. Um, we're really trying to handle being a human in a world that is full of misfortune. For the Epicureans, because death is the end of experience and we do not experience death itself, it can't be bad, right? We're not around going like, oh man, it sucks to be dead, because you don't exist. Um, One of the famous Epicurean arguments, I think it was due to Lucretius later, is like, look, um, you shouldn't be afraid of death being the end of existence any more than you're afraid of the fact that you didn't exist before you were born. And I was born in 1979, which means that I did not exist in, you know, the year 1453. Does it bother me that I didn't exist in 1453? I don't know. I can't say I spent a lot of time on it. So why does it bother me that I won't exist after I die? Right? Because these are the same things. I used to not exist, and I will not exist again. So what? The Epicureans say. Um, and while we're alive, what we should do is pursue happiness or pleasure, um, because all good or bad comes from experience. Right? It's just death is the end of experience. Death can't be bad. So for the Epicureans, what is good is pleasure. What is painful is evil. But pleasure is not just sensory pleasure. Pleasure is a kind of well-being, which is friendship, intellectual contemplation, and modest fulfillment of your basic necessities. Um, right? Because the more you have, the more you're going to suffer from wanting more. So the simple things in life will make you happy, the Epicureans say. Um, and the Epicureans, again, they were very much a skeptical school. The Stoics probably, the Stoics believed in an afterlife. They believed in God, um, or the gods, I should say. Whereas the Epicureans were a lot more skeptics. You might even think of them as ancient atheists, right? So Epicurus gives the first formulation of the problem of evil, and this has this has been discussed for thousands of years since, right? So he says, look, is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Then he's not all powerful. He's not omnipotent. Is he able but not willing? Well, then he's malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Well, then where comes from evil? Is he neither able nor willing? Why call him God? Um, so for Epicurus, the existence of evil is a problem for the existence of an all-powerful, all-good God, because of course God would try and prevent evil. And there are responses to the problem of evil. Some people say evil comes from free will. Some people say this is the best possible world there could be. Right? This is the best God could do, logically speaking. Or maybe it's original sin. The amount of literature here is huge. It's a great paper topic. Um, okay, Epicurus' letter to Menetius. You can kind of read it. I have some slides on Lucretius as well. That's because I'm a fan of the Stoics and Epicureans, so I have like more content on them. And you can kind of have a look at those. Lucretius, I think, is one of my favorite ancient philosophers. His whole poem, the Rerum Naturam, the nature of the world, survives, thankfully. And he gives a beautiful statement of the Epicurean school. So, okay, Aristotle, right, the empiricist who believed in the ethics of virtue. Diogenes and the Cynics who lived on the streets. Stoics, who say you have to align your will with natural law. And Epicureans, who say pursuit of simple pleasures is best and death is the end. Okay, so have a look at those slides. I'm definitely over time, about 40 minutes, and I'll be back hopefully Thursday for a module on medieval philosophy. Thanks so much for listening.